Before there was evil, before the serpent, before the garden, there was him. He wasn't a monster. He wasn't a shadow. He wasn't even a warning. He was light, brilliant, exalted, pure. He stood near the throne. He sang the songs that shaped creation, and for a time there was no name held higher among the angels. But perfection is fragile. It doesn't shatter with war. It cracks with thought. Just one. Why not me? And with that, something ancient broke. Something no one expected. Not in heaven's foundations, but in the heart of its brightest star. He appears only in fragments now. A name scattered across verses. A whisper in prophecy. Sometimes a serpent, sometimes a dragon. Sometimes just the adversary. But the damage was real, and it didn't end in heaven. This is not just the story of an angel who fell. This is the story of pride, of rebellion, of what happens when light turns inward and refuses to bow. This is the story of Lucifer, the angel who became heaven's worst enemy. Lucifer wasn't born into rebellion. He didn't rise from chaos. He was created in light. In the earliest traditions, he was called the morning star, the brightest herald in the heavens, a being of unmatched beauty and majesty. His name, Lucifer, means lightbringer, a title that once carried awe, not dread. He stood among the angels, not as one of many, but as a singular, radiant being, something closer to perfection than anything that came after. Descriptions of his form are rare, buried in poetry and vision, but they hint at something extraordinary. He shimmered like the jewels of Eden, sapphire, onyx, topaz, and gold. His body was robed in glory, his presence like fire without heat, light without shadow. To look upon him was to feel smaller, not out of fear, but reverence. He didn't command with threats. He inspired with presence. The kind of being others followed not because they were told to, but because they wanted to. He wasn't a messenger. He wasn't a soldier. He was something more. Lucifer is said to have stood near the throne itself, within the innermost sanctum of heaven's design. Some traditions call him a covering cherub, a guardian of divine mystery. Others suggest he held a place higher than the archangels, maybe even a role that no longer exists. Whatever he was, it was exalted. He led worship not with words, but with essence. Some believed music flowed through him, that his very being radiated the harmonies that held creation together. He wasn't just in heaven. He was part of how it functioned, part of how it glowed. He was powerful, respected, beautiful. But beauty like that carries a weight, and brilliance casts long shadows. For a time, there was no blemish, no question, no flaw, but that would not last, not even in heaven. It didn't begin with fire or fury. There was no explosion of rage, no dramatic cry against heaven. It began far more quietly, so quietly that no one noticed at first, not even him. Lucifer wasn't born a villain. He was admired, trusted, and elevated, not just for his beauty, but for the role he played among the angels. He was a steward of harmony, a keeper of the divine order, a radiant presence that others willingly followed. Where he walked, there was light. Where he spoke, there was clarity, and for a time, no one carried the weight of heaven more gracefully. He wasn't arrogant. He was composed. There was a kind of nobility to him, dignified, self-assured, unwavering. Some said his voice could stir the stars. Others claimed his mind was sharper than any sword in the heavenly host. He didn't just follow the rules of heaven, he understood them, preserved them, embodied them. And for ages, that was enough. But something shifted, slowly, quietly, beneath the surface. Lucifer didn't lash out. He questioned, not with bitterness, but with reason. He didn't demand power. He wondered why it wasn't already his. Why should one being rule over all? Why should eternity revolve around a single will? Why shouldn't someone else, someone worthy, stand in that place? The thoughts didn't seem dangerous. Not at first. They arrived like whispers in the dark, threading themselves between his duties, taking root where only obedience had lived before. And because no angel had ever fallen, no one knew what to look for. They saw a leader, a brother, a visionary. No one saw the slow unraveling. He still sang the songs, he still stood near the throne, but in his heart, the center of gravity had shifted. No longer content to serve greatness, he began to imagine becoming it. There were no declarations, no shouts, no fury, only silence. And within that silence, ambition, pride, the first flicker of disobedience. And that, more than anything, is what made it so dangerous. Lucifer didn't crash down all at once. He slipped, starting with just one single thought. He was powerful, but it wasn't just strength that made Lucifer dangerous. It was the way he carried it, like fire in still water, serene on the surface, burning just beneath. Lucifer wasn't simply another angel in the choir. He was among the highest, maybe even the highest, depending on the tradition. Not just in rank, but in brilliance, in command, in sheer, unshakable presence. Where others bowed, he stood. Where others sang, he led the chorus. Where others obeyed, he understood. He is called a covering cherub in ancient texts, positioned so close to the throne of God that some believe he guarded it. Others say he reflected it, the way the moon reflects the sun, radiant, majestic, and alive with borrowed power. And then there was his voice. It wasn't just sound, it was a force, layered, harmonious, resonant beyond human comprehension. A voice that could pull emotion from the bones of reality, that could summon awe, joy, fear, or peace without a single word. With that voice, he led the host of heaven in worship, and when he sang, the angels followed. He had dominion over flame, mastery over light. Some say he could bend the very laws of the higher realms, travel between planes, command energy, sway the spirits of lesser beings with nothing more than a glance. But the most dangerous thing he ever wielded was influence. Lucifer didn't rise by brute force. He didn't have to. His authority was effortless. His presence didn't demand attention, it invited it. Even among angels, he was admired, respected, trusted, and that's what made his betrayal so devastating. Because the war didn't begin with swords, it started with a whisper. Lucifer used his power not to destroy, but to persuade. Quietly, carefully, he planted doubt. Not in God, but in the hierarchy. In the idea that only one will should reign. He spoke not of hatred, but of vision. A new order. A restructured heaven where freedom was not a gift from above, but a right claimed by the worthy. And it worked. He moved through the ranks like wind through tall grass. Subtle, constant, unseen until it was too late. He didn't force angels to join him, he inspired them. He knew their desires, their questions, their hidden longing for purpose beyond endless obedience. He gave them something they didn't know they wanted, the idea of choice. And so an army rose, not from the shadows, but from within heaven itself. Tens, hundreds, perhaps even a third of the host aligned themselves with him, not in open rebellion, but in quiet agreement. They followed not out of fear, but because they believed him. They saw in him a new kind of leader. One of them, flawed, free, powerful, not because he was appointed, but because he dared. The Bible describes what followed in brief poetic terms. There was war in heaven. Michael and his angels fought against the dragon. The dragon was Lucifer, transformed by pride, twisted not in flesh but in essence. The same being, but darker, sharper. No longer a steward of light, but a force of disruption. And so the heavens shook. Michael rose, not with speeches, not with debate, but with silence and a sword. He didn't come to reason, he came to restore order. The battle that followed wasn't glorious, it wasn't clean, It wasn't filled with noble speeches or divine miracles. It was brutal, grief-stricken. Heaven turned on itself, not because God had failed, but because Lucifer had. He had everything: power, praise, proximity. But he surrendered the one thing that made him truly holy: submission. And without that, he lost. No matter how bright the flame, no matter how deep the conviction, Lucifer's rebellion could not overcome truth. And when it was over, it was final. Lucifer fell, not because he was weak, but because pride always breaks before it bends. There had never been a fall before. No rebellion, no exile, no precedent for what it meant to be cast out of heaven. The hosts of heaven had always known order, harmony, and light. But then came the first fracture, the first defiance, and it belonged to one of their own. When the war ended, he did not fall in silence. He was expelled with force, cast down like lightning, not drifting but plummeting, ripped from the heights where he once stood as one of the mightiest. Some traditions speak of the gates of heaven sealing behind him like iron shutting on an ancient prison. Others imagine a scream echoing through the void, his wings set ablaze until they blackened and curled, trailing fire as he fell through worlds. But he did not fall alone. The host that followed him, those angels who had once stood in the courts of glory, who had once sung the divine harmonies, were torn down with him. 1/3 of heaven, some say. A staggering number. Not traitors by nature, but by belief. They had believed in him, and now they shared his punishment. They were cast down in fire and fury, their forms warped by the fall. Once radiant, now terrifying. Their wings, once symbols of divine purpose, became twisted shapes of wrath. Their voices, once filled with harmony, broke into cries of anguish, mockery, and madness. But like their leader, they did not vanish, they endured. What rose from the ashes was no longer the angel of light. That radiance, the beauty that once commanded awe, was gone, or perhaps worse, corrupted. In its place stood a being reshaped by hate, the pain of rejection, the sting of shame, the fury of ambition denied. Some say his new form reflected his fall, monstrous, horned, smoldering, his once glorious wings now torn and ragged. His glow turned to shadow. His voice, once like layered choirs, had become a hiss, sharp and cold, filled with venom. A thing to fear, not follow. But others claim the opposite. They say he retained his beauty, that he still glows, still captivates, still speaks in harmonies, because evil, at its most effective, does not come dressed as horror. It comes dressed as desire, as wisdom, as charm. The most dangerous lies aren't ugly, they look like the truth you want to hear. He was no longer Lucifer. That name, the morning star, was a relic of what he had been. Now, he was Ha-Satan, the adversary, in Hebrew. The accuser, the opposer, the one who stands not beside heaven,